The Union Club in Boston smells like mahogany, centuries of old money, and inherited entitlement. We were there for the law firm's 50th anniversary gala, a night that was supposed to be about legacy, but was really built on lies. My sister, Alexis, draped in silk that cost more than my car, pulled my 12-year-old daughter, Abigail, into the center of a circle of high-profile partners. "Meet my charity case niece," Alexis laughed, her voice sharp enough to draw blood, wearing hand-me-downs because her mother prefers the bottom of the ladder. Honestly, with a pedigree like that, the girl has zero future in this town. My parents didn't stop her. They just chuckled into their crystal glasses, like our humiliation was a sacred family tradition. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, while everyone else got the credit? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't scream. I didn't cause the scene Alexis was so clearly fishing for at the Union Club. I just reached down and took Abigail's hand. Her palm was clammy, and her fingers were trembling against my own, but we walked. We walked past the portraits of dead men in heavy gold frames, past the heavy oak doors, and out into the biting Boston night air. The city was glowing with a cold indifference. To everyone else, we were just two more bodies moving through the dark. But in my head, the balance sheet was finally being reconciled. For 30 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had traded my self-respect for their approval and my silence for their peace. Looking at Abigail, as she buckled her seatbelt in the dim light of the car, I realized my compassion had been a luxury they had been overdrafting for decades. I had not been staying because of the love. I had been staying because of the survivor's invisible chains. It is a psychological cage where you are taught that your value is tied entirely to how well you serve people who will never see you. You spend so long in the dark that you start to believe the sun belongs to someone else. By 11:51 p.m., we were back in our apartment. I did not make tea. I did not comfort Abigail with empty promises. I walked straight to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a cold white light that matched the state of my nervous system. Abigail sat beside me, her eyes following my cursor. She did not ask what I was doing. She already knew. She was the one who had helped me write the back-end code for the firm's proprietary research database during those long nights when I was supposed to be merely assisting Alexis with her caseload. Alexis thought she owned the firm because she had the name on the door and the corner office. She thought she was the genius because I had been ghostwriting her briefs for 7 years while she spent our $25,000 monthly stipends on luxury real estate. But she forgot one fundamental rule of the digital age. The person who controls the administrative credentials controls the reality. I navigated to the system settings. My fingers did not shake. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. It was accounting. I started clicking. Delete. Revoke. Deny. One by one, the access keys I had built were invalidated. Alexis's login was terminated. My parents' remote viewing privileges were gone. The entire secure server that housed every brief, every precedent, and every piece of research that actually made the firm functional was now behind a wall they did not have the password to bypass. This was not a breakdown. It was a digital severance. I was not just cutting them off from the data, I was canceling the subscription they had been charging to my soul. By 12:03 a.m., the task was complete. The firm was essentially a hollow shell, and Alexis would not realize it until she tried to log in for her morning meeting. My heart rate stayed steady. There was no guilt, no panic, and certainly no sadness. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I looked at Abigail. She gave me a small, sharp nod. The legacy of the silent partner was over. The legacy of the survivor had begun. The sun didn't rise in Boston that next morning. It just leaked through the gray clouds like a dull neon light hitting the sidewalk. I stayed at my desk. I hadn't moved since 12:03 a.m. My eyes were burning, but my mind was a high-resolution map of every brief, every filing, and every proprietary secret I had buried in that firm's history for the last 7 years. I looked at a stack of printed folders on the corner of my desk. 7 years of invisible ink. 7 years of me being the spine that kept Alexis's high-heeled posture from collapsing. My sister was the legal genius of the year. a title she bought with the words I wrote while Abigail slept in a bassinet next to my keyboard. I remember the first time it happened. It was a corporate merger case worth $15 million. Alexis had come to my studio apartment smelling like expensive gin and panic, crying that she couldn't find the precedent to save her client. I was exhausted. I was a new mother. My compassion was a luxury she didn't deserve, but I was still trapped in those invisible chains back then. I spent 72 hours straight pulling the case apart. I found the loophole. I wrote the 50-page brief that made her a partner, but I intentionally left a complex jurisdictional paradox buried in the footnotes, a legal landmine that only I knew how to defuse if she ever turned on me. When she stood on that stage at the Union Club 5 years ago to accept her promotion, she didn't mention my name once. She didn't even look at me in the back row. She just thanked our parents for their unwavering support. That was the moment I realized our family wasn't a unit, it was a pyramid scheme, and I was the base. My silent labor was the engine. My parents' $25,000 monthly stipends, the ones they used to maintain their sprawling estate in Beacon Hill, weren't coming from the firm's success. They were coming from the billable hours generated by the ingenious data sorting architecture Abigail had developed to optimize our entire research workflow when she was only 9. I watched Abigail wake up and walk into the kitchen. She looked at her laptop, then at me. The firm's internal Slack is going into a tailspin. Mom, she said, her voice flat and clinical. Alexis has tried to reset her password 14 times in the last hour. She thinks it's a server glitch. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking in the silence. It wasn't a glitch. It was an audit. I started pulling up my personal archives. I had kept a shadow ledger of every hour I worked, every brief I ghostwrote, and every line of code Abigail implemented to automate their research department. While they were at the Union Club, laughing about our cheap clothes, they were effectively living on the interest of our intellectual property. My parents saw a charity case when they looked at me. They saw someone who needed a handout because I didn't have the corner office or the designer label on my blazer. But I was looking at the balance sheet. For 7 years, I had provided over $3 million in labor that went unbilled and unacknowledged. I had been the silent partner in a firm that treated me like a line item they could delete whenever it became inconvenient. The phone on my desk began to vibrate. It was my father. I didn't answer. I watched it move across the wood, a frantic mechanical pulse that matched the tone of the text starting to flood in from my mother. Madison, your sister is in a crisis. The firm's data is gone. Why aren't you answering her calls? Stop being so dramatic about last night and help her. I rubbed my eyes. There was no sadness, no panic. There was only the cold, sharp clarity of a reconciled account. My compassion had finally hit zero. My debt to them was paid in full, and then some. This wasn't revenge, it was a repossession of my own value. Abigail, I said, not looking away from the screen. Is the backup encrypted? Double layered. Mom, she replied, her fingers already dancing across the keys as she sipped her juice. If they try a brute force entry, the entire database will wipe itself. It's a clean break. Good, I whispered. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started a new document. It wasn't a brief. It wasn't a code. It was a formal accounting of 7 years of shadow labor. I titled it The Price of Silence. It was time for the charity case to send an invoice. The digital silence I created was soon filled by a roar of social media and internal office rumors. Alexis, unable to bypass the encryption Abigail had set, resorted to the only weapon she had left, character assassination. By 10 a.m., a memo appeared on the firm's internal portal. It didn't address the server issues. Instead, it expressed grave concern for my mental health. Alexis claimed I was unstable, that the pressures of being a single mother had finally fractured my judgment, and that I was isolating our grandmother, Catherine, to secure a larger portion of the estate. My parents' messages shifted from demanding help to threatening my custody of Abigail. Madison, this is a new low. You are manipulating a sick woman. If you don't unlock those servers, we will have no choice but to involve the authorities and social services. It was classic projection. They weren't worried about Catherine's health. They were worried about the $25,000 monthly stipends that were now in jeopardy. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I just forwarded the memo to Catherine's personal attorney. At 2 p.m., an emergency board meeting was called at the firm's downtown headquarters. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and desperation. Alexis sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of practiced tragedy. My parents sat behind her, looking like a jury that had already reached a verdict. When I walked in with Abigail, the silence was sharp. "Madison," Alexis started, her voice a theatrical whisper. "We just want you to get help. This isn't you." "Enough." A voice cut through the room. The heavy doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Catherine entered, supported by her cane, but her spine was as straight as a steel beam. She didn't look like a victim of manipulation. She looked like the general who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. She walked past Alexis, who scrambled to stand up, and took the seat at the center of the table. Catherine didn't start with a lecture. She pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. The room was suddenly filled with Alexis's voice from the Union Club gala, laughing about her charity case niece and Abigail's zero future. The color drained from Alexis's face until she was as white as the marble table. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I have been the silent guardian of this legacy for 50 years, Catherine began, her voice low and lethal. "I watched my daughter and my granddaughter turn into parasites, feeding off the labor of the one person who actually respected the craft." She looked at me, then at Abigail, and I saw a flicker of profound sadness in her eyes. "I stayed quiet for too long," Catherine continued. "I hoped you would find your own integrity. I watched from the shadows, caught between my hope for my own family and the objective truth of your failure." She paused, her hand tightening on her cane. "But time is no longer a luxury I possess. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. This is my deadline. I will not leave the firm I built to a dynasty of vultures. The cleanup begins today." The room went cold. The golden child was finally standing in the dark, and for the first time, Catherine wasn't there to turn on the lamp. The silence following Catherine's announcement wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the boardroom, leaving Alexis gasping for a defense that didn't exist. Catherine didn't wait for her to recover. She signaled to her personal attorney, who placed a heavy crimson folder on the center of the table. While Alexis had been busy drafting memos, Catherine's forensic accountants had been tracing a digital paper trail of misappropriated funds that led straight to a felony. This wasn't just about a server lockout anymore. It was about a crime. The attorney opened the folder and began to read the results of the forensic audit. The room felt like it was shrinking with every word. For the past 18 months, Alexis had been siphoning money from the firm's legacy fund, the $1,500,000 intended for the firm's expansion and community tech grants. She hadn't just been living off her stipend, she had been stealing from the very foundation of the firm's future to fund a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford. Exploiting her limited power of attorney, Alexis had funneled these assets through a network of shell companies disguised as strategic consulting firms, betting that Catherine's trust would outweigh her scrutiny. The documentation was clinical. It showed a series of wire transfers to an offshore account registered under a shell company. But the lethal blow was the signature. The audit included high-resolution scans of the authorization forms. They were signed with Catherine Hayes' name, but the forensic analysis was undeniable. The pressure points, the stroke velocity, the slant, it was a signature mismatch. Alexis had been forging her grandmother's name for over a year, gambling on the fact that Catherine was too focused on the firm's public face to notice the rot in the private ledger. My mother tried to speak, her voice a thin, shaky thread of denial. She asked if there was a mistake, if perhaps the bank had miscoded the entries. Catherine's attorney simply turned the page to the digital logs. Every forged document had been uploaded from Alexis's private terminal at 3:42 a.m. on various Tuesday mornings, the same mornings she used to tell the family she was working late for the firm's legacy. Alexis didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared at the folder like it was a predator that had finally cornered her. The legal genius of the year had been caught in a loop of her own greed. She had assumed that because she had the title, she had the immunity. But in this room, titles were being stripped away like old paint. The $1,500,000 wasn't just a number on a page, it was the weight of a prison sentence. I looked at my parents. They weren't shocked by the betrayal, they were terrified by the consequences. They realized that this wasn't a family drama they could laugh away with a bottle of champagne at the Union Club. This was a criminal referral in the making. Catherine looked at Alexis, and for the first time, there was no shadow of a grandmother left in her eyes. There was only the founder. You called Abigail a charity case because she wears handmade clothes, Catherine said, her voice like grinding stones. But Abigail built the systems that keep this firm alive. You, on the other hand, have been wearing a stolen life. She closed the crimson folder with a final heavy thud. The audit was complete. The villains weren't just ungrateful, they were officially recorded as criminals. The redemption arc was dead. All that was left was the execution of judgment. Alexis didn't wait for a formal invitation to my apartment. She was at my door by 6:45 p.m., her designer heels scuffed from the pavement and her mascara smeared into a map of her own failure. She didn't look like a legal genius anymore. She looked like a bad investment that had finally hit the floor of the market. Behind me, Abigail sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, watching the real-time logs as Alexis's final attempt to bypass the firm's security went up in digital smoke. My sister had tried to steal Abigail's proprietary AI algorithm one last time, hoping to use it as leverage to save her career, but she had triggered the kill switch instead. Now, the data was encrypted, the servers were dark, and Alexis was staring at the end of her professional life. "Unlock it, Madison," she whispered, her voice cracking, as she stepped into my entryway. "I'm on the verge of permanent disbarment. The State Bar Association is opening an inquiry into my fiduciary breaches, and the board is filing a criminal referral for the $1,500,000. Please, for the family." I didn't answer immediately. I walked to my desk and picked up 2 documents. I rubbed my eyes, not out of fatigue, but to sharpen the clarity of the moment. Anger wasn't loud anymore, it was clinical. It was a balance sheet being closed. I had been the silent investor in her version of success for 7 years, footing the bill for her ego while she called my daughter a charity case. Now I realized our relationship hadn't been a bond. It had been a subscription, and I was officially canceling the service. "You called her a charity case because her clothes were cheap," I said, my voice as level as a judge's verdict. "But it turns out you were the only one living on charity all along." I handed her the first document. It was a copy of our great-grandmother Catherine's revised will. Alexis's name had been systematically deleted. In its place was a newly established scholarship fund for underprivileged tech students, the very people Alexis had spent her life looking down upon. The $25,000 monthly stipends she had used to buy her status were gone forever. I watched the realization hit her, a slow-motion collapse of her carefully curated reality. This was the illusion of empty wallet power. In the high society circles of Boston, Alexis's standing had never been about her intellect or her character. It was a luxury she had rented with Catherine's money. Without the cash to cover the membership fee, her prestige was just a hollow shell. She was discovering that when you build your identity on having rather than being, you vanish the moment the account hits zero. "And there is one more thing," I added, handing her the second paper. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the edge of the sheet. It was an eviction notice for our parents' Beacon Hill mansion. Catherine was liquidating the family assets to repay the $1,500,000. Alexis had siphoned from the firm. My parents, the same people who had laughed at Abigail's handmade dress, were now losing the only roof that kept their sense of superiority intact. Alexis looked at me, her eyes red and pleading, searching for a spark of the sisterly compassion she had overdrafted for 30 years. But she found only silence. I didn't feel triumph, and I didn't feel regret. I simply felt the peace of a debt that had finally been settled in full. "You told me Abigail had no future," I said, opening the door for her to leave. "But she's the one who wrote the code you can't break." "You're not the genius, Alexis. You're just the person who forgot to pay for the help." I closed the door, the click of the lock echoing like the final period at the end of a very long, very expensive sentence. The fallout was precise, documented, and permanent. The Bar Association moved with the kind of lethal efficiency they usually reserve for the defenseless. But this time, the predator was the prey. Alexis Hayes was disbarred within 3 months. The legal genius of the year didn't just lose her license, she lost her identity. I heard she eventually took a low-level data entry job far from the Boston elite, a place where no one cares about your pedigree and your name carries no weight. My parents filed for bankruptcy shortly after the auction of the Beacon Hill estate. They discovered that Without the $1,500,000 Alexis had siphoned, or the $25,000 monthly stipends they had stolen from my silence, they were just two more people who had lived beyond their means in a city that forgets you the moment your check bounces. I'm sitting in our new office now. It's a tech legal hybrid, overlooking the Boston Harbor, filled with sunlight and the sound of work that actually belongs to us. The names on the door are ours. We don't have mahogany walls or century-old portraits, but every square inch of this space was earned with integrity. Catherine's legacy fund didn't go to waste. It became the seed for a firm that protects independent creators and silent partners from the very exploitation Abigail and I survived. People often ask me how I could walk away from my own blood. They use words like loyalty and forgiveness as if those concepts are one-way streets. But this journey taught me that letting go of blood for self-discovery isn't a betrayal, it's a reclamation. You cannot find your own light if you are constantly shielding the people who are trying to blow it out. Cutting off a toxic relationship, even if it is family, is not a cruel act. It is a necessary act to find true peace. I spent 30 years trying to fit into a mold that was designed to break me. Once I stopped asking for their permission to exist, I finally began to live. I opened the old shadow ledger on my screen. One last time this morning. I stared at the $3 million in unpaid labor, the thousands of hours Abigail and I had gifted to people who saw us as burdens. It used to be a record of my pain. Now, it was just data from a closed account. I highlighted the entire file, my finger steady on the trackpad, and I hit delete. Abigail is in the corner of the office now, mentoring a group of young scholarship students from the tech fund Catherine established. She isn't shrinking anymore. She isn't checking for impact. She is talking loudly, explaining a line of code, her hands moving with confidence as she takes up every bit of space she was born to occupy. The steady hum of our independent office is the only legacy I ever really wanted. Justice didn't just take its course, it paved a new one. If this story reminded you that your worth is not defined by those who try to dim your light, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't let them keep you small.